Canister stoves are really popular nowadays, and the reason is because they're really compact. They've got a lot of nice systems. They're small, they're lightweight, they're easy to use, and so for most of the time, like 90% of the time, they are probably the right tool for the job. But we still have to understand the limitations and kind of the pros and cons of this different stove system to kind of get the best performance. You know, canister stoves don't do well in cold temperatures. They don't generally do well at higher elevations. And one of the downsides of a canister stove is that they can't be repaired in the field. And so depending on, how long the trip and how remote the trip, that could have a real effect if that is your only way, of say heating water to make a dehydrated meal, or, if you have to melt snow to actually make water. So we have to kind of weigh these out and kind of figure out what the best tool for the job is. So the way these work is they come with a pressurized canister, and as you screw the stove on and ignite the stove, as that fuel is burned off, the pressure in this canister decreases. And as the pressure decreases, the efficiency of the stove, as a general rule, is going to continue to go down until the point where there's a little bit of fuel left, but you really don't have a really strong flame that's going to do much. The other thing is, because of this pressure and performance relationship, that in the cold weather, if this canister gets cold, that pressure goes down as well. So in cold weather, we really have to work on insulating these canisters to keep them warm. So, what I like to do if I have, multiple canisters, or depending on the trip, if I'm only going to use the stove when I'm, in the tent, in my sleeping bag, that I'm going to take this canister, I'm going to put it in the bottom of my sleeping bag, and then when I pack it up in the tent, that sleeping bag insulation is going to insulate the canister and keep it, if not warm, it's going to keep it from freezing, and that's really what we're looking for. If it's something that I'm going to be accessing, say in the pocket of my puffy jacket, because I'm going to brew up at maybe a glassing knob, or multiple times during the day, then I'll keep it in that puffy jacket pocket. And again, that's just enough to kind of keep the chill off. But you have to figure out something. I see this mistake, quite often, where, the canister's kind of thrown in the backpack, the weather's cold, or you're in your tent and you just kind of sit the canister in your tent, just kind of sitting there overnight, and temperatures get to freezing or below. And then the next morning, the stove doesn't want to run efficiently. It's hard to kind of coax the performance out of it. So that is all based on the pressure in this canister, and that is affected among many other things besides just fuel decrease, which is temperature. The other thing you have to consider is when you're using this canister stove, that you want to still consider keeping the canister insulated. So in really cold weather, if I just take this canister and sit it on the bare ground or on a rock, and I light it, I have some water I want to boil, and I walk away to do some other things, not only is pressure leaving as the fuel's burned down, but it's also getting cold because of the environmental conditions. So, one thing I like to do is this small closed cell foam pad that I use to sit on for glassing. I will put that on the ground. I will take the stove, I will put that on that pad, which insulates this from the ground. So the same mechanisms of heat loss that affect us as human beings when we're out there is the same effects that are going to work on this stove. So I put the foam pad down and I insulate it. Now, in really cold temperatures, especially if I'm sitting there trying to melt snow, for camp water, what I'll do is I'll sit there in my puffy jacket, maybe my puffy pants. If it's really cold, I may even be in my sleeping bag. And I'm going to take this stove and I'm going to sit it on my thigh, and I'm going to take my gloved hands and wrap them around that canister. And you would be amazed at the increase in performance. So if it's sitting on the foam pad, it's not doing so well. If you take it and place it on your thigh and wrap your gloved hands around the canister, you can audibly hear the intensity of the flame increase, and your boil times are gonna become much quicker. So that is really the Achilles heel that you have to think about. But the other thing is, a lot of people don't actually look at the stove, they actually look at the stove system. So when you look at these different stoves and you actually look at the size of the burner head, you know, some burner heads are very small in relation to the size of the cook pot, whereas some have very large burner heads that meet the same circumference. So again, the increase in that burner head size is the increase in the heat, is the increase in the performance. So you really have to kind of look. There's a lot of products on the market. We have a lot of choices. You know, but some absolutely work better than others. Another one is, how well do canister stoves do in the wind? Some of these canister stoves do incredibly well in the wind, whereas others, unless you you know, put them around or put them with some rocks around them or some different wind breaks, you know, that wind is going to strip away a lot of heat, and it's not really going to you know, it's not really going to add that efficiency that you're looking for. The other thing is, fuel consumption is a little difficult to plan for with a canister stove. So the reason is because you can't, like I said, normally burn all the fuel out. I mean, some of these stoves you can pretty much burn all the fuel out of a canister. Some of these others you can't. So, you know, it's a little difficult. So, you know, I strongly encourage everyone to go out, especially if it's a new stove, and burn test the stove to figure out fuel consumption. But a 4-ounce canister, generally speaking, you're going to get 2 to 3 days per person out of that canister. Now, that assumes a few things, and what that assumes is, you know, how often are you using the stove? Are you just using it to boil up, say, a cup of coffee in the morning and a dehydrated meal at night, or are you using it multiple times a day to brew up and make, you know, soup or hot tea or something like that? That's going to affect fuel consumption. I was able to get away with 7.5 days out of a 4-ounce canister on a solo dull sheep hunt up in the Brooks Range a couple years ago. But I would, in the morning, you know, make a cup of coffee, so about 16 ounces I would boil. And then at night I would have another cup of, you know, tea or coffee, 16 ounces, and then my dehydrated meal. And then I had a running water source, so I didn't have to, you know, melt snow. I was at about 4,000 to 5,000 feet in elevation, so not a lot of elevation, but the temperatures were anywhere from, you know, 30 degrees, so just a little bit below freezing, to about 40 degrees, so kind of right in that temperature range. But again, with a disciplined approach, understanding, you know, my food and kind of how I was disciplined enough, I was able to get 7.5 days out. 2 or 3 days is probably about average, at least for initial planning purposes. But, you know, you have to go out and burn test these stoves, you know, on their own. And so how I would do that is I would put a liter of water in the cook pot. I would turn the stove on and I'd start my stopwatch, and I would see how many minutes it took to boil 1 liter of water. So now I have that time. And then I would go ahead and continue to just burn that stove until the fuel was burned out completely, or the flame was low enough that I said, well, okay, it's not really going to be effective anymore. And I would have those 2 times, and then I would say, hey, it took me, you know, 2 minutes to boil a liter of water, and I'm getting 40 minutes out of a canister, and I can extrapolate and go, I can get X number of liters. Now, assuming, you know, altitude and things like that, but at least it gives you a baseline to start from. And, you know, of course, if there's any question, you can always bring another canister. You know, the worst thing is to be driven out of the mountains because you didn't bring enough fuel. So now that dehydrated food isn't working for you, or you can't, you know, if you're boiling water to purify it, or if you're, you know, melting snow to make drinking water, you don't want to be driven out of the mountains for lack of fuel consumption. So, you know, again, if we understand how these canister systems work, you know, there's some really great attributes. Like I said, they're kind of the 90% solution for a lot of us. There are a few, you know, situations where they don't work, but if we understand, you know, how they work and how they integrate, then we can really coax the best performance out of it for the wilderness.